The lies we're told daily are so widespread it would take forever to enumerate and explain them all. But we were taught some whoppers when I was a kid that haunted me, and I expect most of my peers, until I finally learned that they were just lies. For example, I clearly remember lying in bed, worrying that I might spontaneously combust and need to stop, drop, and roll before an unexpected fire consumed me. Or I'd be out riding my bike and need to fend off drug dealers offering me free drugs and kidnappers in creepy vans, all while hoping I didn't disappear into a pit of quicksand. Then I'd go to school and my teachers would insist we needed to memorize the spelling of every word since we'd never have help as an adult. Then in the next class, we'd be forced to memorize and recite multiplication tables because we wouldn't have a calculator in our pockets all the time in the future. It was an uneasy existence. The crazy things we were taught and honestly believed in the 80s and 90s were numerous. Still, I was thinking the other day, wondering what happened to some of these definite, serious dangers that we were supposed to face all the time that somehow didn't materialize. In this video, I'll talk about 12 of the biggest of these lies. I'll also talk a little about why our elders thought these were important to teach us. And finally, I'll talk a little about how these kinds of things didn't really go away, just the worries changed. Before we dive into the fun, I do want to remind you that as someone born in 1980, I consider myself part of the Xennial generation. I aim to explore concepts through this channel from our unique perspective, since Xennials are the only generation raised both analog and digital. My videos showcase my philosophical understanding of the subject, supplemented with verifiable facts and information to support my beliefs. If you disagree or have something to add, I welcome your thoughts and opinions in the comments below. As always, there are chapters in the description that will let you skip to any section you want. Thanks for checking out my creation. If you're new here at the Xennial Philosopher, I hope you'll subscribe and return soon to continue expanding your perception and growing your mind alongside me. Okay, let's jump in now. There are some entertaining, in retrospect, topics to cover here. We'll start with a doozy of a lie I constantly heard about as a kid: the Bermuda Triangle. If you were like me, in elementary and middle school, the teachers would regularly hand out these little newspaper magazines called Weekly Reader with articles for kids. I remember getting several of these where the main subject was the dangers and mysteries of the Bermuda Triangle. First, I want to clarify that when I was in elementary, I lived in the Midwest of the US and was nowhere near the Bermuda Triangle. I was nowhere near any bodies of water larger than a lake or the Mississippi. But still, I remember worrying myself to sleep that someday I might need to traverse this exceedingly dangerous piece of water for some reason. These fears were primarily unfounded because I was in a landlocked state and had few prospects of going to that part of the world. But I had seen the mysteries printed on paper and talked about on TV. My parents and teachers even seemed to think it was likely something to worry about. Like most of my generation, I learned the far less exciting and decidedly not scary reality that the Bermuda Triangle's mysteries were just an old sailor's tale. People have always traveled through this insidious area, and they were fine. Planes and boats regularly traverse this part of the sea with no issues outside of the usual hazards of being at sea. I was even shocked to realize that one corner of this triangle was Miami. Yes, the massive city on the coast of Florida was technically within the borders of this Bermuda Triangle. I'm trying to keep this video light, so I won't go into a bunch of facts and details about the allegedly mysterious triangle in the Atlantic, but there are some links in the description to scientific articles. Suffice it to say that if you want to go to the Bahamas, Miami, or anywhere down there, the last thing you need to worry about is your plane or the ship disappearing into thin air. Another thing I thought about way too much as a kid was quicksand. Again, I was living in the Midwest where it would be virtually impossible to come across any of this allegedly life-threatening stuff. Still, my little kid brain was terrified that I'd die in this terrible way. I don't clearly remember teachers telling me about quicksand, but I remember the hero in so many movies I liked getting trapped in the sucking sand pits we worried about. I had years of youthful worry about walking through a field or playing on a playground and suddenly stepping into a pit of quicksand that would mercilessly suffocate me in the slowest, most torturous method I could think of. Of course, as I grew up, I learned that quicksand, while technically it does exist, is very unlikely to kill you and even really be that big of a deal. Most importantly, quicksand shows up far more in literature and film than it does in real life. Overall, the phenomenon is exceedingly rare. In the vast majority of cases where a spot of quicksand or similarly dangerous mud actually exists, it's nowhere near deep enough to engulf the average child, let alone an adult. Despite the imagery, quicksand does not reside in endlessly deep pits, and the process of sinking into them is anything but quick. For one, you would need to struggle to sink into the stuff actively, and if you remain calm, you won't sink. If you have a buddy with you, they can use a stick to pull you out quickly. If you're alone, all you need to do is spread your weight out. Lie down, and then you can crawl or roll away from the sand. Disappearing in the Bermuda Triangle and suffocating in treacherous quicksand were plenty, but the world is relentless and made sure we had plenty of worries about fire, too. I don't know about your experiences, but when I was in elementary and middle school, I was regularly reminded how to survive being on fire. All the lessons and posters we had that told us to stop, drop, and roll when we were lit on fire. Now, I'm not saying that the advice of stop, drop, and roll isn't helpful. If you ever find yourself on fire, you should absolutely stop, drop, and roll around to put out the flames. Of course, they teach a different technique these days. I also can't deny that the method of constantly reminding us about this hazard was effective. I mean, all of us remembers those lessons well, even as middle-aged adults. But I have to wonder at the logic of terrifying all the kids in America into believing that they could suddenly find themselves on fire. That at any moment they'd need to frantically roll around on the ground to save themselves from being consumed by flames. But my, and I bet most of your childhood worries about dying by fire were only fueled by the regular stories we heard about spontaneous human combustion. If you don't remember the spontaneous human combustion craze in the late 80s and early 90s, it was everywhere. I mean, regular segments on the local evening news, even articles in newspapers. And not the crazy ones like Weekly World News. These stories were in all the papers and on everyone's tongues for quite a while. Now, couple this new fear of spontaneously starting on fire with our constant and ongoing reminders from our elders that we should be ready to put ourselves out at any minute, and you have nightmare fuel for a whole generation of children. Maybe the Cold War was calming down when we were in school, but the adults wanted us to be as paranoid as they had been all their lives. It had to be something like that because we all know that they didn't stop with mysterious triangles, quicksand, and fire. We also had to be sufficiently afraid of drugs. As I got a little older, like late elementary and into middle school, the teachers' lessons and warnings shifted from telling us how to avoid a flaming and hellish death to telling us that we would all become addicted to and eventually overdose on drugs. I mean, I was told 100 times that one day a devilishly charming drug dealer would offer me drugs so that they could get me hooked. These stories were rarely specific about the kind of drugs, but they left me absolutely no doubt that if I wanted to try drugs, I would just need to choose from among a plethora of drug dealers offering me free dope. I could easily do a whole hour on the D.A.R.E program and how it caused way more problems than it ever fixed. But again, trying to keep this lighter and a dive into the D.A.R.E program would require a bunch of talk about Ronald Reagan. Check out my video about billionaires if you want to hear about some of Reagan's evil deeds. In short, the Cold War was no longer the biggest worry in the world. Nuclear arms treaties had let our nation and leaders relax about the threat of nuclear annihilation. They couldn't very well let children of America grow up without some terrible scourge to worry about, so they picked, very generically, drugs. This led us to getting endless education about the dangers of all illegal drugs, and we were constantly warned of nefarious dealers who would get us hooked to free drugs. Of course, like the nuclear annihilation that our parents worried about, it all turned out to be a bunch of lies wrapped around propaganda. The primary drug they warned us about was marijuana, as they like to call it, which, by the way, is legal in most of the country now. Let's do some lightning rounds, starting with the academic lies we were told. This last main category is the biggest one, and I think most of us worried about the future nearly daily because of some of these academic lies. But I'm going to try to get through this section fast. Okay, here we go. Permanent records. In school, there was a thing that teachers and administrators loved to threaten us with: our permanent records. I don't know about you, but I spent many years being much quieter and asking far fewer questions than I wanted, precisely because of the threat of marks on my permanent record. I started to wonder if all U.S. schools were somehow connected to an FBI-style database or something that our future employers and creditors would have easy and unfettered access to. We all know 30 years later that these threats were just that. There was no permanent record. There was no large nationwide databases filled with all kids' visits to the principal's office. To confirm this was the case, when I was under FBI review to get a security clearance in the Army, I asked if my visits to the principal's office and detentions would matter. The agent laughed and said there are no school-related records unless you're put into juvenile detention or otherwise committed a crime for which you're charged. So like so many other things they told us, our elders were just trying to scare us into being good. Permanent records weren't enough for them, though. Math was another thing that we experienced a unique kind of torture for. For generations that attended public school before the 80s, there were barely calculators, let alone computers. So for all the school kids, for decades before we went through the gauntlet that is school, they did need to memorize multiplication tables and be able to do all the math in their head. Unfortunately for us, our teachers were stuck in the past and couldn't fathom a world where we would have smartphones in our pockets and MacBooks in our backpacks. Because of this short-sightedness, our elders were adamant that we memorize all the math, specifically, as we heard repeatedly, because you won't have a calculator in your pocket all the time when you're an adult. Grammar. The math memorization we were forced to do was all just part of the rote memorization required of our young and developing minds. Along the same lines as math, our teachers took grammar and spelling to a level of Machiavellian torture because there was no way spell check would ever be good enough to help. They also drilled into our minds the importance of cursive handwriting, even going so far as to warn us we'd be unable to get jobs in the future without a working knowledge of cursive reading and writing. They were also keen to ensure that every document we created had 2 spaces after every period. That one was so hammered into me that it took me years to train myself not to double tap the spacebar at the end of every sentence. But they didn't stop there. Even though we had typing and computer classes on computers and not typewriters, our teachers could not fathom a world where any research could be done anywhere but at a library. Because of their certainty of the immortal nature of libraries and paper books, they insisted we had to know and understand the card catalog system. Then, if we ever wanted to learn anything, we would need an expert-level understanding of the convoluted Dewey Decimal System. As you and I know, Google does not require Dewey Decimals to find reference materials, and most books are now digital. They told us lies about college, degrees, and how we might fare in interviews if we didn't listen. But this is not meant to be a comprehensive list of every lie we dealt with, but it should have covered most of the major ones. Please let me know in the comments of any I missed or of any interesting stories you've got related to a childhood fear that turned out to be nothing. Before I wrap up this video, there are a few honorable mentions that didn't have enough substance to make it into the central part of this video, but were too good to leave out. Honorable mentions. That flashing your headlights at a car with theirs off might cause a gang to kill you. This rumor seemed to have spread throughout the country. I even heard it repeated by cousins who lived in rural areas. I can't find proof that this was a thing that happened, but because of these stories, I still hesitate to flash my lights at a car with their headlights off. Stepping on a crack will break your mother's back. This is more of an elementary thing, but in kindergarten, some kid told you not to step on cracks in the sidewalk lest you break your mother's back. I am 43 and have stepped on countless cracks in my life, and my mother's back is fine. That gum stays in your system forever or blocks your stomach. How many times were you told if you swallowed gum, it stayed in your digestive system forever? Eventually, if you ate enough, it would completely block up your stomach and kill you. They sure like to threaten us with death for simple things. It has since been proven that this is decidedly not the case and that you digest gum like anything else. I know there are lots more, but let's talk about all that other stuff down below in the comments. Conclusion. Thankfully, we no longer live in a world where whatever our teacher or aunt says must be true because there's no easy way to verify anything. We live in a vastly different time where we can easily search for anything we could dream of. But we have a separate problem today. How much of the information that we have such easy access to is accurate? The level of falsehoods and outright lies presented as facts today are far more harmful than when we were kids. Drilling a way to save yourself from fire, or what your elders assumed would be a critical skill, may have ultimately been useless to us in adulthood, and they may have cost us some sleep as children, but they didn't ultimately hurt us. But the massive amounts of information spread around today with enthusiasm on the web are as likely to be entirely made up as they are to be actual, factual truth. So kids today face several serious problems that cost them sleep much the same way that we paid. Today, kids do regular active shooter drills and have to genuinely worry about this kind of thing happening. In addition, it is much more complicated today to discern the truth and lies from each other among the deluge of available information. While you might be tempted to be upset at the crazy things our elders told us, You need to remember that they were mostly doing it from a good place in an attempt to protect children. We as Xennials have a unique perspective, having been the only generation raised both digital and analog, and I believe that perspective puts us in a uniquely qualified place to help both our elders and younger generations to be better at identifying what is real and what is propaganda. If you want to learn more about immunizing yourself against the propaganda in the modern world, check out my video, Propaganda About Propaganda: How Not to Be Brainwashed. What did you think about these concepts? Do you plan to learn more from the resources below? Did you hear something today you'd like me to do a whole video on? Let me know in the comments if your interest has been piqued by any of the subjects covered here at the Xennial Philosopher. Check out the references and links to related videos and articles in the description to learn more about this video's topics. If you still need to subscribe to the channel, remember so that you'll get all the new videos to expand your mind and grow your perception.